Hey guys, and welcome back to Monka, where stupid shit ensues, but yesterday I beat my first game of 2023, so I wanted to talk about it a little bit. And since I was relatively excited to play this game, I also wanted to talk about, because that's just kind of what we do on this channel, but what game did I beat, and what was the first game that I played and beat in 2023? The game I played was Death End Request 2 for the Nintendo Switch specifically. I've spoken on Death End Request. Obviously, this is the sequel to Death End Request. I liked Death End Request, the original one, a lot. And so I was relatively excited to play this game, to be honest. This is like one of the two games this year that I really wanted to play. The other one being Caligula Effect 2. But other than that, Death End Request 2 was really up there for one of the games that I really wanted to play this year. Just due to the fact of how good Death End Request was, despite its flaws. It was still a really good game, and I was still really excited to play the sequel, Death End Request 2. Hopefully we eventually get a Death End Request 3, because I actually really like this series, but I played the Nintendo Switch version. This game originally came out in February of 2021. I believe this game got ported to the Switch in the US at least in early 2022, so there was a couple of years before this made it to the West. At least that's what I'm recalling. Maybe that was just my bad memory, but I recall buying this in February 2022 and pre-ordering it. That's just to what I recall, though. Death End Request 2 is a sequel to Death End Request. The game is still published by Idea Factory, developed by Compile Heart. Compile Heart is very well known for the Neptunia series, but they also made Dragon Star, Fairy Fencer, as well as Death End Request, amongst other games. Death End Request 2 took me a total of 30 hours to beat. That's about 10 hours shorter than what it took me to beat Death End Request at 40 hours, but long and short, my opinion is this better than the original Death End Request? I don't think so, really. But honestly, it's still a really good game that I absolutely recommend playing. I am not disappointed one bit by this game. The reality of this game is that it's more of Death End Request, so if you enjoyed Death End Request, you'll enjoy Death End Request 2. And it still tells a really good story, so I really do enjoy this game. I absolutely recommend it. Death End Request was a sleeper hit, and Death End Request 2 seemingly got less attention. It's still a really good game. I absolutely recommend it. If you just want more to the world of Death End Request, or the gameplay, or anything related to Death End Request, this is just more while making somewhat incremental improvements upon the game as well. But first thing to start out with Death End Request 2 is the graphics. Now, I kind of failed to mention it in the original video I made about the original Death End Request, but the game is divided into two segments, which is visual novel and then the gameplay. I kind of failed to mention my opinion on the graphics of the visual novel, but that's the good half of the graphics of Death End Request 2 and Death End Request, because the sprites, the environments, all hand-drawn or whatever, look really nice. The sprites of the characters look really nice. They're animated well and everything. And overall, the visual novel part of Death End Request and Death End Request 2 is pretty good. Now, in terms of the graphics of the gameplay, Compile Heart, what the fuck, man? I mean, I'll say this, the performance, at least this time around in Death End Request 2, is better than what it was in Death End Request. That's not saying a lot, because the performance in Death End Request 2 was absolutely atrocious. And I've already expressed my opinion about that. The performance in the original Death End Request, at least on the Switch, was terrible. This time, it's not as bad, but it's still bad. The game still fluctuates horrifically in frame rate. I feel like it's because it doesn't have a capped frame rate. So it can jump from 15 at one point to 16 at another point. Like I said, it's not that bad this time around as it was the last time around, but it is still nonetheless bad. Like, the performance is still bad in this game, at least for the Nintendo Switch version. So to say the least, if you're going to play it, by far the worst way to play it is on the Nintendo Switch, unfortunately. The game also doesn't look all that great, so the performance being bad isn't really justified by the graphics being good, because the graphics are bad and so is the performance. Compile Heart just really needs to figure this shit out about this, because this is the second game I played, and I imagine when I play Fairy Fencer and Dragon Star, and when I eventually get to Mega Dimension Neptunia on the Switch, they're all going to perform bad as well. Honestly, they're going to have to figure it out. Probably by the time they figure it out, the Nintendo Switch Pro or whatever will be out, so it won't even matter. But in terms of graphics, on the visual novel side, it looks good. The portraits, the sprites, everything with the visual novel aspect looks great. I love it. The graphics for the gameplay are bad. The performance for the gameplay is bad. It is nowhere near as bad as Death Death End Request, but it is still bad. I feel like if they kept the frame rate, that might have fixed the issue, since the frame rate is uncapped, so it can switch from like 15 to 60 frames, like just like that. Like I said though, the performance isn't as bad. I think it's because the game scaled back on its scope a little bit. The world isn't as open as it was in Death End Request. But in terms of the music and voice actors, the voice actors this time around, I played it with the Japanese voice actors per usual, and overall the Japanese voice actors are really good, especially compared to the English voice actors. I listened to a little bit of the English voice actors watching a playthrough when I was trying to understand the ending, because I'll get to that when I get to the story, but the English voice actors aren't all that great. The Japanese voice actors are really good, and they really do bring out their characters, and they really do go nuts. Like, there are points in this game that, like, it's Death End Request, so if you understand the original, you know that it's like a gruesome and violent game, but there's points where the voice actors just bring that out, and it made me like wince. Like, it made me like like, you know, they like just like coughing up blood and like gasping and like screaming. Like, it's all really visceral and really well done by the voice actors, so they really do their part. You feel the emotional moments for every voice actor, you feel like the scary moments, you feel like the terror and grief and just like everything about it. Like, the voice actors really play their part in this game, at least for the Japanese ones. Like, just the screaming and everything, and like they just do a well job of bringing out like just the terror of this game that you will feel. But they also do a good part in just playing their roles as characters, especially for the main characters. They really do their part. Some of the side characters, voice actors are kind of so-so, but for like the main characters, they do their part really well for voice acting. Now, in terms of the music this time around isn't as good as it was in Death End Request, but there are still some fucking bangers in this soundtrack nonetheless. Like, this soundtrack has some bangers in it that is like really good. Some of the battle themes are really what I enjoy. Like I said, they're not as good as the battle theme in Death End Request, but they're still good. I enjoy the type of music that they kind of go with, the stylization of it. I feel like due to the setting, they have kind of more of an archaic soundtrack with like more trying to sound like an older soundtrack rather than what they went with in Death End Request with like kind of like the synthetic sounding. They still do have some of that synth sound in Death End Request 2, but they kind of scale it back in Death End Request 2. It is worth mentioning the fact that they do reuse some songs from Death End Request. I didn't expect this. I kind of expected an original soundtrack, but that's kind of not what you get with this game. It does have some of the older songs. It's the good ones, I won't lie, so they do have good songs from the original Death End Request, and I can appreciate that. I was just kind of hoping for an all-original soundtrack, which it's not an all-original soundtrack. Kind of disappointing in my opinion, but it's not bad. The new songs they do introduce are good, and there are, like I said, some bangers in the soundtrack. The old songs they use are good as well, but I just kind of wish they went with an all-original soundtrack just to kind of make the sound new. But overall, the voice actors, they do their part. Like, they go nuts. They sound really, really good, at least in Japanese, and for every, like, God, like the moments in Death End Request, I'm gonna gush about Death End Request, but they have some brutal ass moments in Death End Request too. They also had brutal ass moments in Death End Request, but they go brutal in fucking Death End Request. And for those brutal moments, the voice actors just do their fucking parts. So this time around, golly, the voice actors are good, for Japanese at least. I enjoyed them. I would definitely recommend playing it in Japanese. The English voice actors, from what I heard, don't sound very good, so I would not recommend it. In terms of the soundtrack, the new part has some bangers in it. I definitely enjoyed some songs in the newer part of the soundtrack, and the songs they bring back for the older soundtrack are also very good. I just wish they would have went with an all-original soundtrack instead of reusing songs from the original Death End Request. Now, in terms of the story is kind of interesting. Story and characters, I should say, because this time around it is a sequel to Death End Request. However, it's not like a direct sequel exactly. You do have to understand Death End Request to go into Death End Request 2, and they do not explain it to catch up newer players. So you do have to play the original Death End Request to understand Death End Request 2. That being said, the story is not a direct follow-up to Death End Request, but the concepts used in Death End Request are referenced heavily in Death End Request 2. So you do have to understand Death End Request to play the sequel. The story is kind of weird starting off, because understanding the plot of Death End Request 2, I kind of went into it expecting a certain thing, and it didn't exactly go that way, because it uses the concepts from the ending of Death End Request and applies them in Death End Request 2. Now, the long and the short of the story of Death End Request is a female named Mai Toyama ends up losing her family, all except for her sister, and is transferred to a place in Europe called Leishora, specifically to an orphanage called Wordsworth. Now, she mainly goes there in search of her sister, Sanai, who ends up not being there, but once she gets to Wordsworth, strange things start happening in the town of Le Chauret, and she has to figure it out with her two found buddies that she makes at Wordsworth, known as Roddy and Liliana. The world kind of ends up warping, and these weird things called shadow matter show up and start disrupting the world's flow, and really the town of Le Chauret is in a weird kind of limbo that is not understood. So in Mai's quest to find her sister Sanai, she's also investigating the abnormality of the town of Le Chauret. Now that's a very, very, very basic way of putting the story, but that's because I do not want to spoil the story because it is really, really good. I really like the story of Death End Request 2. It is very kind of confusing at points, to be honest, because they do not like to explain certain things at some points. They kind of like to try to let the player figure it out, and I kind of can appreciate that because near the end they do explain a lot, but there's a lot of nuance throughout the story that shows like certain things going on that like they reference certain things and you pick up on it later and you're like, oh shit, that piece was laid there because of this. Like they were actually like, there's a lot of nuance to the story that's really good. The story is kind of weird. There are recurring characters that come back from Death End Request. No spoilers though, of course, but they do bring back characters and concepts from the original Death End Request and implement them in Death End Request 2. I can really appreciate the story. It is no less gruesome this time around than it was in Death End Request. I'd argue they go harder in Death End Request 2 than they did in Death End Request. I don't know. My mind kind of fails me as to how hard Death End Request went with like the gore and like everything gruesome and the violence, but this game has some strong horror JRPG elements to it, and it does really well with those horror JRPG elements, and it is just bloody, gruesome. It is something refreshing for the JRPG genre, to be honest, because JRPGs don't usually go this hard. This is a really good story, and honestly, I really, really enjoyed the story. Like I said, I don't want to speak on it too much because the nuance and everything, I don't want to spoil it, but it is just a really good story. It does get confusing near the end. They do explain a lot of kind of what is confusing throughout the story near the end, but the ending is kind of like the original Death End Request, confusing. I watched it a second time, and that's kind of where I came up with the English voice actors, but I kind of skimmed through it a second time and I came to understand it when I experienced it, but the first time around it was very confusing for the ending. Now in terms of the characters are pretty good this time around. They keep the cast of at least main characters pretty small to 3 characters, which is Mai, the main character, and then Roddy and Liliana, the 2 friends of Mai that she makes at Wordsworth. Besides that, you also have some other main characters, some of those being reoccurring characters from the original Death End Request, and all of them are pretty good, and all of them have a lot of personality, and I feel like that's because they keep the cast small enough to where they can build these characters up really strongly. Instead of having a huge cast where you have to work with the limitations of building up their characters, you have a smaller cast that you can really focus on and really build up the characters really well, and that's really the direction that they went. They went with a small cast that they could build up the characters of really well, and I can really appreciate that. So in terms of the characters, I think scaling back was the best decision they could have made. It really brings out their characters better and really allows them to build on them. And these characters are really strong. They have a good development. They have good personalities. You really enjoy them. So when bad things start happening to the characters, you start to get kind of worried and you feel bad because these characters have been developing and you've been watching them develop. So in terms of the characters, they do them really well, and I really enjoyed the characters. And as well, like I said, the story is really well done this time around too. As good as Death End Request? Maybe not. I don't think this is as good of a story as Death End Request, but it's still a good, really good story. And they do take a new angle on the story instead of doing what Death End Request did. They take a new approach to it, and I can really appreciate that. Now, in terms of the gameplay, it's divided up into 2 segments. Like the previous one, it's divided up into the visual novel aspect and then the gameplay aspect, which is dungeon crawling and battling and turn-based combat. A lot of my opinions on this come down to what I said in Death End Request. Both parts are really good, but I'll re-explain it, of course, because this is a new video. The game split between visual novel and gameplay is kind of a 50-50. I can't really say which one is more prominent. It probably most likely is a 50-50 split between visual novel and gameplay. That's something worth noting if you don't like visual novels or whatnot, because it is very visual novel heavy, and it's very heavy on telling the story through the visual novel. No complaints about the visual novel aspect. I enjoy it. They do the same thing they did the first time around, which is they don't really show all that gore in the visual novel aspect. They just don't really show it. They do a really good job of explaining it. They do a really good job of like voice acting affecting it, which really makes you feel it, but they really don't show it a whole hell of a lot, to be honest. Maybe in Death End Request 3 if they ever make one, which I hope to God they do. But in Death End Request 3, maybe they'll be a little bit less gun shy about showing what they maybe want to show and actually get like into the visual aspect of it and show all that like gruesome shit. But we'll have to wait and see if they ever make a Death End Request 3, and if they do, we'll have to see if they do that. But in terms of the visual novel aspect, it's pretty good. I enjoy it. Like I said before, going to the graphics, it's all well animated and everything, so I enjoyed it. Now, the gameplay aspect of Death End Request 2 is a lot like Death End Request. It has the dungeon crawling aspect where you're crawling through the dungeons, and then you're also doing turn-based battle. Now, the dungeon crawling this time around is a lot more linear than it is in Death End Request. It still has the same aspect of pretty much you go from visual novel to dungeon crawling. There isn't really an overworld or anything, and all the dungeons are connected as well. It's a really similar to Death End Request. There aren't a lot of improvements in this aspect. It has a lot of the same things where characters can use their skills in the environment to unveil certain things. The exploration in the dungeon crawling isn't anything all that crazy. I think, like I said, they really scaled the scope back for Death End Request 2. It's not as open as it was in Death End Request. Considering the fact that Death End Request had pretty narrow scope anyways, it kind of becomes a hallway simulator in Death End Request 2. Not really that big of a complaint for me. There are still some open aspects. The environments are pretty cool as well. There isn't a lot of variety though. It's pretty much based in the city of Le Chore, as well as having some aspects in kind of the countryside of Le Chore. They don't do a lot of improvements for the dungeon crawling aspect in Death End Request 2. They had something kind of annoying called the Chaos Matter, which will at random segments pop up and start to chase you through the dungeons, and if it catches you, it's a game over. I don't like that aspect, and honestly I wish that they didn't do it. It feels like it was just kind of something experimental that they tried out, but I didn't really like it, and I wish that aspect wasn't in it, because really all it does is disrupt the flow of the game. Once the Shadow Matter shows up, you just have to run away and just wait for a bit, and once it goes away you can just keep progressing, but it really just hampers progression for no good reason. Now, in terms of the turn-based combat, it's a lot of the same from the first game, but they do some things slightly better. This time around, you only really have 3 main party characters, like I said. Now, they try to kind of mitigate this by reintroducing the old characters from Death End Request into Death End Request 2 as avatars that you can use for turn-based combat. I didn't really go with this aspect due to the fact that I wanted to use the new characters instead of using the old characters. I've already played Death End Request, so I don't need to replay them in Death End Request 2. However, they are there for you to use if you feel the 3 party characters that you use throughout the game are too limiting. You can go back to the old party characters of Death End Request and use them as well. Since the party is scaled to 3 the same way as Death End Request was, pretty much your 3 main characters are going to occupy your 3 main party slots, so it works out pretty perfectly. I didn't mind playing the same 3 characters for the entirety of the game. Some people might, so that's probably why they introduced the avatars into the game. In terms of the gameplay, it's a lot of the same for the turn-based combat as it was in Death End Request, and like I've said, it is very familiar to something like Neptunia. If you played Neptunia, you'll be very familiar with this gameplay. It is a turn-based combat system where the characters can openly roam the map and attack from certain angles, and as well they reintroduce the knockback mechanic that lets you pretty much ping-pong the characters around the stage. Now, in this time around, they do have something called Overkill, which is one of these slightly better improvements that they add. Pretty much Overkill allows it that if you start knocking the characters around like crazy and they keep getting knocked around, that you're just not watching them get knocked around, but instead are accumulating more XP for pretty much overkilling them. It's kind of a cool concept. Early game is kind of overpowered because it lets you over level, at least in the early game. Late game, it doesn't matter as much. They do take out the hacks in Death End Request 2. They kind of scale back the combat in some ways, but also progress in some ways. It is a lot of the same though from Death End Request. One of the improvements they did make is that going into Limit Break isn't as hard in this game as it was in Death End Request. Like I said, in Death End Request, I only did it a handful of times that I can remember. Limit breaking is a lot more common in Death End Request 2. It's appreciated because it makes the game better and more enjoyable, and boss fights, limit breaking is pretty much damn near required. I do like the fact that limit breaking in this game is a lot more common than it was in Death End Request. For the most part, the combat in the game is pretty easy. It's not that hard until like the very end. The final boss is something fucking else in terms of difficulty. That final boss is fucking hard. But besides that, the rest of the game is pretty simple. It's not that hard, or at least it's not not too hard, to be honest. But in terms of the gameplay, it's more the same from Death End Request, just with slight improvements. Some things removed, some things added. I kind of feel like they went experimental. Hopefully that pans out into something better for Death End Request 3. Like I said, they make it, but the gameplay is more Death End Request. I can appreciate that. And if you enjoyed the gameplay from Death End Request, you'll enjoy Death End Request 2. But overall, what are my opinions on Death End Request 2? Well, if you can't tell, I really enjoyed this game, and I can really appreciate what Compile Heart did here. Hopefully there's Death End Request 3, because I really enjoyed this series. Probably my favorite series so far from Compile Heart. I've yet to play Dragon Star Varnier and Fairy Fencer F. Those might be some great games, but by far these are some of my favorite games from Compile Heart currently. I hope there's a Death End Request 3. A lot of what they do here is really good. I really enjoyed the story. I enjoyed the gameplay. I enjoyed the characters as well. Like I said, it's not as good as Death End Request, unfortunately, but it's still a really good game nonetheless. I can't complain about it because it does something new. It tries new things and introduces new characters. It's just more of Death End Request. So if you enjoyed Death End Request, you'll absolutely enjoy Death End Request 2. And honestly, this was a great way to open up 2023. I really enjoyed this game. I absolutely recommend it for Compile Heart fans. If you're a fan of Death End Request 2, absolutely check this game out. And hopefully we get a Death End Request 3. But thank you very much for watching. Until next time, I'll see you. Stay chill.